Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sgwrs. I'm Emma Jackson-Phillips, Associate Advisor for Languages, Literacy and Communication at Central South Consortium. I'm joined by Ian Timbrell, who's Deputy Head at Cumbach Primary School in Rhondda Cynon Taf, Sian Ford, Second in English and Literacy Lead at Whitmore High School in the Vale, and Sue Ann Davith, who's Deputy Head, and Beth Ann Reynolds, who's Foundation Phase Teacher, and they are both from Ysgol Pencae, Cardiff. Today we're going to be discussing a really scary topic, grammar. Actually, we're going to be working our hardest to kind of dispel the myths that grammar is intimidating and outdated. So let's begin. First of all, I want to ask you guys, what are some of the perceptions of grammar and how might some of these perceptions present challenges in the education system?
I think people are quite afraid of it, aren't they? I think both teaching it and pupils in a way, and a lot of it really, I was never really taught grammar in school. So suddenly you're thrown into a classroom where you've got to teach these words and phrases that you really don't know what they mean. And, I'm talking from a Key Stage 2 level. I can only, think about non-specialist teachers in Key Stage 3 and 4, how they may feel. So I think, it is quite a nerve-wracking topic for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think sorry, you go. No, go. I was just saying, me and Sarah have a similar conversation yesterday where I really don't remember experiencing much grammar at school, specifically primary school. I do remember sort of everyone turned to page whatever in your text.
Yeah.
Today we're looking at homophones, and it just kind of seemed so divorced from everything else that we were doing. That was, especially in primary school, everything seems so exciting and new, and then you've got these stuffy lessons that are sort of just bolted on to everything else that's happening, and it just seems so irrelevant, really. So when you've got that experience in school, it's very difficult then, or I found it very difficult initially to get excited about grammar when it came to teaching it, and I've had to relearn or even learn for the first time a lot of things so that I'm able to teach them to the children.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be like that, and I appreciate your honesty there, that it's not just kind of the notion in society that is purist and unnecessary and scary, but it's the fact that, do we have the subject knowledge ourselves, and where do we get that subject knowledge from if we're not taught grammar?
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think a lot of it as well, that a lot of what came out from the home learning was that the terms that we use to describe the different elements of grammar can, like you say, come across as quite scary. And puts people off, and I know there was the big fronted adverbial debate of why are we teaching pupils this, why do they need to know this, and actually when you look at what it is, it's not that complicated, but it just appears it because it sounds more complicated. And I think, like you say, I don't remember being taught grammar either when I was younger, but I think it's one of those things where it has to be done, but like you say, not as a bolt-on, because then it gets lost. It needs to be integrated into study, into lessons, so that it's building upon the skills and that they become embedded. And I think that's, like you say, that there are, primary teachers and other subjects, specialist teachers in secondary that aren't necessarily English trained or trained in that area. And not just to the pupils, but to those, it does seem quite a scary aspect of trying to teach something that again seems more complicated.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I haven't been intimidated by it, but then I had to think, well, actually I've done an A level in English language. That's where my subject knowledge has come from, but I wasn't taught it lower down, apart from maybe in those bolt-on lessons you describe. Do you think that perhaps the digital age makes it even more difficult to kind of show the importance of grammar then, do you think?
I would say yes, because text speak. We also have autocorrect, which is so heavily relied upon that, and anybody, adults or children, don't have to think that hard about the way they're expressing something, because their phone will not always get it right, but will quite often and would on Word or slides, PowerPoint, any of those, the spell check, it does a lot of the work for you. So I think there is an element of people thinking, well, I don't need to do it because it will do it for me.
Yeah, and I think there's a misconception too that they think that it's going to do it for them, but without that understanding to get it close to what it should be, the editing process of any spell checker is lost and things get really wrong, don't they? Yeah. So I think there's a massive misconception. And I was going to say, I think another misconception is if a child can read, people think they've got the grammar because they're reading it, where actually they don't make the connections and they don't understand. But definitely,
I would say on that, I'm seeing more pupils now who have got higher reading ages and reading scores, but their writing isn't reflective of the same level.
Yeah, definitely. And when you come to understanding what you've read, you have to have an understanding of that underlayer of the grammar, don't you? And children haven't got that, and that's where they miss out, really.
No, I totally agree, and there's no getting away from it. And do you think some of these issues are kind of compounded by the home learning? Because I know that a lot of the submission of work during COVID-19 and the lockdowns was obviously word processed. So do you think some kind of the kind of cogs and the mechanics of grammar were almost lost a little bit by the word processing?
Yeah, and I had a 6-year-old through the pandemic in Welsh medium school, and it was interesting, me having to help him with his writing as a teacher made me really feel I was at a loss a lot of the time how to help him with this language that I'm not fluent in. So I can only appreciate how a lot of parents felt, even in their first language, trying to teach these children grammar, and a sentence is wrong, how do you help that child? And I think, as a profession, we're struggling at how to do that. So how on earth the parents coped who haven't got training background, teaching background, I really feel for them.
Completely. And I think Sue-Ann and Bethan can definitely add to that in terms of their experience as Welsh medium practitioners, because they're kind of, obviously it's important to teach grammar explicitly, but it's taught very, very differently in Welsh and English, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And that's one thing that we definitely see. We've got a lot of children that maybe think of the English grammar because that's their first language, but actually the sentence structure and the syntax in Welsh is completely different. So we have to kind of relearn the grammar to them when we're, we start with Welsh, obviously, in the foundation phase. So we teach them the grammar through Welsh. And then once they reach year 3, that's when we introduce English grammar to them. But although obviously there's some things that are quite similar, on a word level, once we put it into sentence level, it's completely different the way that we, construct our sentences. And you've got the mutations on top of everything. You've got verb tenses that are a lot more complicated in Welsh than they would be in English. There's more variations. So and obviously we teach Welsh, English, alternatively. So you really mix and match between both languages. So it's quite a jigsaw. But what we saw with the lockdown, when they came back from the first lockdown, we saw a massive dip in their, we call them the basics. So the grammar, the spelling, and they came back and we were like, oh goodness, as in what are we going to do? And we basically down tools, didn't we? And for the first 6 weeks back, all we did was grammar, word level, sentence level work.
Spelling, capital letters, full stop, space between the words, that kind of thing. Yeah, just back to basics.
Yeah. And the progress was quick because we were giving it so much time. So by the second lockdown, I think we didn't see as much of a dip. And I think that was because when our blended learning was much better, because we had much better skills ourselves on how to, prepare the lessons for them. But secondly, we decided that was all going to be basics. We weren't going to push them. We were, in the first one, we were like, write a diary. Well, we were like, no. Don't write a diary. Give us sentences that are grammatically correct.
And I think that's the big takeaway, isn't it, from all this is we've got to be, if we're stripped back to home learning and we can only do what's really important, grammar's got to play a part in that. It's something we can do. You know, we see then when they did return to school that period of just concentrating on the basics just had such an impact then on the second time they came back. So we did reap the benefits then afterwards.
Yeah. And that's so encouraging, because, you know, you were talking about, oh, you know, you're thinking, oh, you're going to be able to write a diary and this. What is the point? You know, there is no point in going on to diary writing if the pupils don't understand what constitutes a sentence, or even what comes before that. So that's really
different in both languages as well. But I will say, and you know, one positive aspect of it, if they do have an understanding of grammar, if they've got a good grasp of grammar in their home language, it's just a platform for the second language then, and they can make the links and they can see the similarities and differences. It's far easier for them to see it if they do have a grasp of grammar and of sentence construction and how things, you know, how language works in their home language. Then it can be used as a tool to help them access the second language then when they're learning.
And I think it just shows how grammar is the foundation of language. So if you get that foundation right in whatever language, then it's going to help them in all languages, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's another key message that we're kind of trying to hit home on a separate piece of professional learning. That kind of plurilingualism isn't a hindrance. It helps in all languages. So thank you for that. It's really, really encouraging to hear that, stripping it back to basics. Although, you know, you had to go quite far back, the progress was quick. So thinking about then, you know, you touched upon how important grammar is. Can we have effective writing without effective grammar? How do we kind of show the pupils how important grammar is?
I think it's thinking about actually what is good writing, and actually, you know, there is this debate about actually how accurate do we need them to be. At the end of the day, if you can make sense, does it have to be perfect? And you know, what is perfect grammar at the end of the day, you know, and that's a separate conversation. But actually, what are the priorities? The priority is that they get their message across and that the genre reflects actually what it is. And then what we have to be very careful of is if we get too bogged down with the details of things like spelling and grammar, we can turn these children off writing. And I know certainly I hated literacy in secondary school, absolutely hated it. And I was quite fearful at going into teaching actually because of my experience in school, because it was all because spellings and things like that actually there was no joy in the writing. You know, who are you writing for? What are you trying to get out of this piece of writing? That big picture was lost. I think we do need the small picture stuff, you know, the grammar, the spelling, punctuation, all that, but let's balance it. Let's make it realistic for the children.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to some of the principles that we're really trying to demonstrate with this area of professional learning, is that I think when you divorce the grammar from the content, it does become dry, it does become uninteresting, it is uninspiring. But when you put that grammar teaching back in the content and use it to deepen their understanding, then you can bring the love and the joy and the importance of writing home to the pupils. So it's kind of like trying to get that balance right. What are some of the...
Sorry, can I just...
Go on, Chan, sorry.
I just wanted to say, from a secondary point of view, obviously for us, everything we do has to be geared up to preparing them for their exams and obviously preparing them for when they leave school. And unfortunately, a big part of the mark scheme is accuracy in their English language exams. So totally appreciate where you're coming from in terms of teaching and bringing the joy back, and that's absolutely needs to be there. And like I agree, Emma, if we do it as part of the content, then we can make it so it's not so dry. But it is really important at secondary level that they have that grammar, because their meaning can get lost if it's not, but also it is going to have a massive impact on them. They might write the most wonderful narrative piece or descriptive piece or argumentative piece in their exam, but if it's not grammatically correct, you know, even if it's incredibly creative, it's going to, the mark scheme split into two. So they get a mark for their content and organisation, and they get a mark for their accuracy. So as wonderful as it is, they could be up the top band for the content, but if the accuracy is really poor, it will pull them right back down. So it is something that we have to kind of continue to drill, certainly in secondary.
Yeah,
I think
and
it just boils down to how you teach grammar, doesn't it?
completely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Completely.
As I said, because I've seen children, they don't want to write because they think, oh, I don't know how to spell that. They ask you every single word. How do I spell this? How should I say this? What goes in this sentence? And you think, well, actually, you're not going to show your flair if you're thinking about every single
That's
detail.
it.
But obviously, there's an end game too, isn't there?
Yeah.
But what we're seeing as we just do snippets of grammar, little and often within our lessons, actually it is having an impact on the end product and what they can create, but it's not drowning them into only thinking about it. Becomes automatic in their writing.
I think need automaticity.
That's what we're aiming for, isn't it?
Definitely.
And also by getting this automaticity, what I spent a period as a teacher, a specialist teacher, and what I saw from the other end, children who were really struggling, they couldn't get anything on the paper, not because they didn't want to, but because they really did not know where to begin, or and how to get these ideas in their head down on paper. They couldn't think of how to structure things, how to spell things. They really did not know what to put on that paper. So really, it can be quite freeing. Rules can really help some children.
I agree.
It can make them more creative, and it can make them more enthusiastic. Once they know how to structure something on paper and how to get these ideas that are swimming around in their head down in a really ordered way that makes sense, and that they can read back and feel proud of, that can be quite freeing for them, and it can give them a lot of self-confidence. So I think, these rules, as stuffy as they are, need to be taught in a way that's not overwhelming for them, but also people need to understand it's not just to make the good writers better. It's to enable children who really can't get anything down because they don't know any of these rules. It's to give them just a basic structure to get their ideas down and to feel good about writing again.
Yeah,
I think sometimes as well, I found that pupils, when it obviously depends on how it's taught, but when you do some of those grammar activities or lessons, it's one of the areas in English where there is actually a right or a wrong answer. And they quite like that sometimes, that in terms of, a lot of what we do in secondary is very subjective, and a lot of the analysis they do is very subjective. Yet when it comes to grammar, there is something specific that we're perhaps looking at. I'm not saying it's the only area, and I think sometimes as well, they feel like they're really learning when they're learning that skill. I've seen taught some lower ability pupils, but they've actually really enjoyed knowing that they've picked up a skill or part of that skill. And don't get me wrong, they don't get it straight away. It's not like they've been taught it once, or they've practiced it once and they remember it. But we've got a group of pupils that are doing the direct instruction expressive writing program, and they're doing that in humanities lesson. They're coming into my English class and they're talking to me about run-on sentences, and they're applying it across the board, and they're really enjoying it because they can see the progress they're making.
I think we need to make sure that we caveat the sort of right and wrong, because I think there is an issue in education at the moment. For a prime example is you can't start a sentence with and. Well, of course you can, in the right situation. And I think that's where I think you're absolutely right that, grammar is one area where children can achieve and see that right and wrong, but we need to make sure that we're also showing them actually there are exceptions to it, and those more creative writers, and going, do you know what, like I'm reading J.K. Rowling's new book at the moment, and she's full of starting a sentence with and I don't know how many times I've heard teachers say you can't start a sentence, but all you go is but I think that's touches on what we were talking to earlier, was that our own teacher knowledge. I think teachers, because lots of teachers' knowledge isn't where it should be, they then stick so rigidly to these inverted commas rules, and actually you have to in secondary then undo a lot of that, because they're not. So it is about that teacher education of that fluidity of language and that creativity of language, but you need that structure at the same time. You need some rules, otherwise,
in that, for example, if they're doing work on sentences, there is only one particular point in the example they may be given where the full stop should go, for example, or where the capital letters need to be. I totally appreciate what you're saying, and I think that may be where, as an English specialist, obviously I'm not totally aware of what's some of the things that are being taught in primary, And I think, like you say, there are some rules where at primary you've got to be good at everything, whereas I get the luxury of being able to just solely use my subject knowledge and in my subject. So yeah, I think some of those rules we do need to be really wary of and make sure that pupils are being allowed creativity within it.
Yeah, which I
absolutely.
suppose brings me on to my next kind of point, really, in terms of, should there perhaps be more work within and across clusters to kind of decide and define and sequence grammar education so that there's continuity and that there's shared language? What would you say about that kind of point there?
I mean, I could say I'm disappointed with how little grammar's mentioned in the new curriculum. I think I'm very disappointed because I think it's been given even a less priority when actually all research is showing across English speaking countries that grammar is in a dire state, really. So I am disappointed that, and my fear is it's going to be taught even less in the priority, and secondaries then, as you said, you've got to get the grammar's got to be there. You're going to have an even bigger slog, and it's important for us then to do some work around that with those expectations of actually, but what order do you do things in, because it's still, we've had lots of discussions in our school about, we've still got children coming to year 5 and 6 who struggle with full stops, and yet they're doing loads of other situations. Well, hang on a minute, if they can't write a simple sentence, should they be doing subordinate clauses and relative clauses, things like that? So I think that's where some work is needed, maybe with actually what are the what are the basics, what do they need to know before they move on to the next step.
Yeah, and Ian, that's part of the reason where this kind of professional learning comes from, really, in terms of thinking about the way grammar is taught at the moment, and thinking about where it could be, and thinking about what's kind of needed. What do you think are some of the issues with common approaches to teaching grammar at the moment? Because writing standards, they've been heavily impacted by COVID, school closures. Writing is always the kind of weakest area in teacher assessment. The regional comparative judgment data indicates weak writing scores, especially when compared to England. There's a kind of 22-month regression. Why is the data so bad, and what should we be doing to improve it?
I think if it's being taught in closed activities. Children are being taught, say, I'm trying to think, homophones, fill in the gaps. Well, great, but if they don't apply the homophones into their own sentences, they're never gonna understand how to use them. I did a lesson on connectives last week, and there was only a selection of connectives. The children could explain to me what they meant, but they could not use them in the sentences. So that showed me they would have been able to fill the gaps, they would have been perfect, but actually using it in their own writing and where they were constructing the sentences, they weren't there. And I had to revisit it many times during that week because, they needed a scaffolding, they needed the experience of using it. And it wasn't, you couldn't do it within a closed activity. Would seem that they were confident, but actually as writers, they weren't.
Yeah, we were saying it's like with maths, it's like learning addition and never being able to apply this in a real life context. You're not giving them real situations where they would use it, so it never gets stored then in memory, and they can never see the purpose of it. So things you don't see the purpose of, you just forget them, don't you? You just put them to one side and go, oh, I want to learn about the Romans, or you move on.
I think I would say what you've just said then, and what Ian said as well about don't get them to do extra other punctuation if they can't. They need to master the full stop first, for example, and a simple sentence first, and then move on. And I think that's really key as well, that the activities they do, that they're built on and that they're revisited, and that they continue to have opportunities to practice those skills in their own work. Because like you say, if they do an activity and they think, yeah, I've got it, great, and they don't come back to it, they're not going to lift it and apply it in their own writing.
And that's where the mapping across the school and within clusters is going to come in, because we need to know, if we're building on prior knowledge, we need to know what this prior knowledge is, and we need to know that it's going to be consistent when they come to you in secondary. That you're not going to have some schools doing some things and some doing the others, and then what you've got is a big jumble of children that you all need to get to the same place. when they arrive with you in year 7, there needs to be consistency, you know, with the steps throughout school, but also across clusters, so that it's being taught consistently and planned properly. And
that would be so helpful, because we do unfortunately get, and it's not just down to ability levels, but just the way that things have perhaps been taught differently, or there's been different focuses in different primaries.
Different terminology.
Different terminology. And I think, you know, as well, I think it would help primaries if you had the expectation of what we would like or what we expect, and it would help us if we knew where they're going to be. And I think there does need to be more engagement between.
We basically need a list of the non-negotiables by year 6. The non-negotiable for the cluster high school is that the children can A, B, C, D, and you know,
and we can work backwards. We can go, okay, so in order to get to that place, they'll get to me and you, and then I need to start on this, and then, you know, we work through until we get to year 6. And I think that's the only way to do it, really, is we go backwards and we go. And also something, we were talking about this yesterday, some things are done to death because that's what teachers are comfortable with teaching. So this is what they're going to do time and time again with children, because they enjoy it, they get it, so they're going to do it. They can think of creative ways to do it. Whereas what we really need to know is, okay, what have they been taught before they got to me, and how am I supposed to move them on? And there almost needs to be something there as a point of reference for teachers, otherwise they're not going to do it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, almost like a kind of grammar framework or a grammar continuum. I mean, I know grammar education isn't linear and it isn't always hierarchical, but some kind of structure or framework, that's definitely one for CSE to bear in mind there. I think in terms of working, you know, primary to secondary, I think there is a gap, particularly at secondary, when we inherit pupils, because you know, we're not completely confident about what the pupils know and what they've been taught. But also it's this kind of age-old fact that secondary school teachers are so maybe focused on their individual discipline that they don't perhaps see themselves as teachers of grammar. So we've touched upon the idea that grammar needs to be taught in context, not in discrete lessons. We've touched a little bit about the kind of pointlessness of grammar tests, and the idea of revisiting concepts and starting basic, making sure that students know what a sentence is before we move on. The idea that grammar is every teacher's responsibility. Ian, I know you've done a huge amount of research in this area. Perhaps you wanted to share some of your findings in terms of grammar instruction. I think that'd be really helpful.
Yes, I completed my master's this year. My dissertation was around effective teaching of grammar across English-speaking countries, and it was really interesting because I started in the 1970s when it all stopped, and it was basically down to the fact that people were not teaching grammar in context. They were in these siloed lessons, and then of course children couldn't apply them, so suddenly all the research showed that grammar had no impact on writing, and that's because it was taught out of context, you know. So that's the first thing we have to remember, because actually a lot of current research, particularly by Deborah Myhill, and if anyone's really interested in the research, she's an excellent person to read up on, has found that it can have huge impact on the end product. You know, you teach them good grammar, and particularly where we need to be careful with continua and things like that is, right, I'm going to do front adverbials this week, that's what I'm going to do, irrelevant of what the genre is, because actually front adverbials suit certain genre, and a really good example is like relative clauses. You know, you shouldn't really have relative clauses necessarily in say right, scary story. You know, you don't want those long sentences in a scary story necessarily. You want short, sharp, let's build the tension. Then other areas, they are suitable. So, and that is down to teacher knowledge of knowing actually, when do I teach these different things? Not just I'm year 3, I'm going to do front adverbials all year, and every piece of writing I'm going to do.
Absolutely.
And that is teacher knowledge, and that's something that I've, you know, had to do a lot of work myself on, because as a primary teacher, I have never been taught that in any course, in anything I've ever done. So I think that's it's about upskilling us. And something that was a really interesting piece of research I found in England was about how good teachers thought they were at grammar. there's quite a huge study done by Jurison who found that teachers thought they were quite poor at grammar, and actually when he did tests they were even worse at grammar on average than,
Wow.
than they thought, which is scary.
Oh gosh.
That we have this. And the schools which had better writing results were those that had invested in effective grammar teaching, but the first thing that they did was invest in the grammar knowledge of the teachers. So actually, do our teachers understand these terms? Do our teachers understand these things? So that's really important. And they're the main findings, really. Start with the teachers. Let's start with their knowledge. And we did it here. I did 6 twilights on grammar teaching, and 3 of them were just on. I was just teaching the staff these grammatical terms. Some of them had never come across the phrase relative clause before in their life, But then, when you are introducing your curricula, very much all in context, all useful. Something as we say here, and it's our own sort of mantra, is when they're doing their grammar lesson, they should be able to use those sentences in their final piece of writing. And that's something that we found has been incredibly effective.
That's great, and thank you for offering some ways forward there. So we've touched upon issues of kind of staff proficiency and staff confidence and the value placed on grammar, and how we kind of promote that importance for our pupils. How do we encourage all teachers to see themselves as teachers of grammar then? Very easy question to answer that one, eh? Offer your golden nuggets.
We had a professional, like a HMS inset, where, as Ian said, we were quite concerned about the lack of grammar in the curriculum. So we have created a grammar framework, and it's the ideal framework. We're not completely stuck to it, but we had teachers working in different groups, looking at different elements of grammar, and just thinking, okay, by the end of reception, what are we aiming for most children to be able to do? Yeah. By the end of year 1, what are we aiming? So
it's not term 1 you have to do this.
No.
Again, like you say, it is down to teacher knowledge and picking and choosing what you do when. But that we've got during reception year, they should have the experience of.
And the reality is, not every child is going to succeed. Of course they're not, because they're all different. But there's a go-to for every teacher, whatever year they're teaching, to know the kind of thing. As a school, we would like to explore during the year and develop the skills of the children. And what we found doing that was not only it was professional development for the staff, because they were discussing grammar.
I was just about to ask that.
Yeah, they were saying, I've never heard of that. Exactly what you were saying. People were teaching each other. I do this. It's when you do that. And they were using different knowledge from different people to know how to teach different elements and what they were. They were thinking, the reception teacher was thinking about year 6 and what our end game was, and seeing that continuum in the whole school, and it put an onus on them. They created that plan, so if they created it, then they've made the agreement and they've made the decision that that's what they're going to work on in their classes. We could have easily had a day out of the class and created all of this for them, but the fact that they were there participating and writing it themselves, it's been really powerful for us.
And also, I think you touched upon it, but there needs to be a culture in schools of, I don't know this, openness, honesty. I don't know how to teach this. I haven't been taught it myself in school. This is really scary for me. Who can help me out? I need to be trained. And I think everyone needs to just start having these conversations about grammar, because once you do, it's like, oh, me. I think it's quite scary how many people then step up and say, no, I don't know how to do this. I've been bumbling my way through this, but please help me. And I think it's just, just having these opportunities to actually put your hand up and say, I don't know how to do this, in a place where it feels safe and it's okay to be honest and no one gets punished for it, will help things develop.
We might laugh.
I mean, that's the kind of culture that we want to create in our classrooms, really, really encouraging, and nobody's afraid to make a mistake. There's no such thing as a silly question. I just love that idea, the idea that by upskilling staff, you've had the inadvertent impact of kind of building confidence and value, giving staff ownership over this kind of grammar framework, the openness and the honesty to admit, you know, when there are things that you perhaps don't have the subject knowledge in. And obviously that's going to have a knock-on impact on the pupils as well. Sian, what do you think in terms of kind of ways forward? Do you think there is a specific aspect we need to target, maybe a culture of grammar or a framework? What would you see as...
I think it's difficult at secondary, because obviously subject specialist teachers, many of them will think that they're not a teacher of literacy, and I know we're all aware that every teacher is a teacher of literacy. If you're communicating in any way, whether it's orally or in writing, that is essentially literacy. So it's about trying to make the staff see and understand, I think, in terms of the impact that they have as well, and the fact that every time we speak to the class or we write something down, we are modelling our own literacy. And so I know certainly with me in I've got you know, our humanities department, so they do quite a lot in their schemes with literacy to have that focus, but I'm actually taking some of the writing revolution strategies, and I'm going to be rolling them out whole school. But I'll do it via an inset first, and I want the staff to have the opportunity where I'll not only explain why we're doing it, but give them the opportunity to A, practice them themselves, and B, create some resources that they can use. And it's not about putting one in every single lesson, but so that they're throughout the schemes every so often. And some of those tasks are brilliant for starters, or exit tickets, or as a little pit stop in the middle just to kind of test their knowledge or get them to check back over their writing. So that's something that I'm doing in terms of developing writing whole school. I think going forward, I do think it would be really useful, especially with the new curriculum, if we had something in place that was grammar focused, because like you say, there is a real possibility that in some schools and it will get lost and become a bit of, I'm concerned it'll become a bit of an afterthought. So I think that a continuum would be really useful if we could look at maybe, and I know, you know, we'd have to start at essentially exam level, and unfortunately at the moment we don't know what our new exams are going to look like, but you know, we'd start at what skills they need for that, and that's what we plan all our schemes of learning on, all the way back to year 7, so that they've got the opportunity to develop those skills. Obviously we want to develop their English skills for after school as well in the wider world, but it'd be really useful if we could work back down to year 7 and then have discussion with our clusters about, like you said earlier, about what that then looks like for primary.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's even important perhaps for secondary school teachers to know what happens further down, because there's been quite a few times where I've inherited, you know, a rather weak year 7 class where, you know, I do need to go a little bit further back and maybe upskill myself in terms of how to educate them in their grammar. And Central South is listening, so these things which you're asking for, I'm making some notes here. Another question that I'd like to pose would be, I know we've talked a little bit about curriculum for Wales, but how important is curriculum planning for successful grammar instruction? And is Curriculum for Wales our opportunity to promote the importance of grammar and collaborate with colleagues in terms of how it should be taught and in what order? I know you mentioned that it didn't quite have as prominent position as you wanted it to have, but a lot of the decisions about curricula are school level decisions now. So it's kind of up to us to prioritise it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's an opportunity here, because now all languages are in the one AULE. What is fascinating is the fact that when we talk about any other language but English, we talk about the teaching of grammar. You know, you wouldn't teach French without teaching the grammar bit. It's madness that we don't do it in our own language. So I think this is an opportunity to learn from, you know, Welsh medium colleagues, but actually how do they approach the teaching of grammar, because there is expertise all over Wales with that, certainly at primary level. You know, let's have a look at that and how is it taught, share that experience. because I'm sure that many of the approaches would be effective in the teaching of English. You know, I know from my own son, the progress they make is incredible. So it is really, I think, yeah, it's an opportunity to work together, because I think very often we would do work with Welsh medium and English medium colleagues, but it's about other things. I can't ever remember working together on languages together. So I think this is a real opportunity for that.
Yeah, and I think that's quite clear in curriculum for Wales, isn't it? The idea that we perhaps need to view English as a language, not just as a subject, and work with our Welsh medium colleagues and our international languages colleagues, and exploit those links between languages that can form those deep, meaningful connections and really deepen learners' understanding of it. Sian, I can see that you want to add a point there.
All I was going to say is, for us, I mean, I tend to find, and we've been pulling on the way that the French is taught and the verbs and how they're taught when we're teaching the verb to be, because quite often people struggle to understand being verbs and that they're actually verbs, and there's something that we do, although we're not consciously doing them, and it is really useful. The only thing that we struggle with at secondary level is that. And I can see how it could be really useful at primary, but we're at totally different phases of language acquisition. So by the time they get to us at secondary, we can use some of those elements to help them when they're struggling with certain verbs. But with the Welsh and the French or Spanish, they're at a totally different stage. So we found it quite more challenging, should we say, to draw links in terms of an AI. But what we have done is we're introducing something called the Awesome 9. So we have 9 academic, words that would be useful for writing, and then they have the Spanish and the French. And I think we're adding the Welsh. And that the idea is that the pupils certainly in MFL, it's something that we've collaborated with them on. They start the lessons with saying the French word and what's the ending. And so we're going to trial that in English with things like notably, and then make sure that they're words, and then we get them to use them in a sentence during the lesson at some point, so they're applying it. But otherwise, we're finding that's something useful. We find it a bit more difficult because the level and the language acquisition is quite different. And obviously, English is, for us, yes, it's about the language, absolutely, but it's also about the literature. And I know they're combining the Welsh language and literature GCSE and the English language and literature GCSE to have a bit more parity across the two. But I think at the moment, it's, going forwards, when we know what that looks like, we might be able to have a bit more collaboration in shared approaches.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing those insights. I think Sue-Ann and Bethan can definitely kind of contribute here in terms of exploiting those links between languages, because it's kind of your bread and butter, really, isn't it? You've been doing this since day dot, haven't you? So we can definitely learn from our Welsh medium colleagues.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Yeah, we were just nodding along really when you were speaking it. Yeah, so one thing I've been doing a lot with Year 1 this year is I think because I've got a background as well in additional learning needs, I think colours and pictures are magic to me. And what I've been trying to do is helping them to understand the meaning of things with pictures, but also helping them to categorise these things with colours. So verbs are all yellow, adjectives are all purple and have this symbol, and so they're able to pick out these things and jigsaw them together. And I'm able to give them a colour and picture pattern for a sentence that would apply to a genre, and then they've almost got a jigsaw where they can build, right, they know. So we've been doing past tense verbs today because we've been rewriting stories, and they know, right, well, I need this sentence now starts with a verb, but I can't say the verb in this way because it's something that has happened. I'm going to have to change the ending because it's right at the beginning of the sentence now, it's not in the middle. So you're giving them these clues that hopefully then when they go to talk about verbs and adjectives, when they start English at the end of Year 2, beginning of Year 3, hopefully they won't have to start from dot and go, okay, this is a verb, this is the kind of,
exactly.
They'll have that language, they'll have that understanding of the concept of, and they'll be able to categorize words into different, well, colours maybe in their minds then, but eventually those colours won't be needed, and they'll be able to structure sentences in languages according to their understanding of what comes where.
And this is going to develop into a whole school thing where we do, you know, we want them to know a verb is a verb.
Yeah.
So wherever you are in French, because we do French from year 2, I don't know what a verb is in French. But as in a verb is a verb is whatever is in French, is whatever is in German. You know, if you walk, you care that it's something that you're doing. So that connection is made. You know, obviously there's differences then, so you've got Cerddais, you've got walked, whatever,
the tenses and the, you know,
that comes after, but the actual bread and butter of what a verb is the same in every language. What an adjective is the same in every language.
So I can group these all together, and this is what I understand about this kind of word, you know, so it just gives them
the foundation
really for it's more complex,
you know, and lightens the load and makes everybody's job a lot easier. So finally, to wrap up our Sgwrs, our podcast, I'd like to ask you if there are any texts that have influenced your practice around grammar, and are there any that have resonated with you? But I'm aware that this is probably quite a tricky question, because what I could find were lots of books on grammar, lots of books on teaching, not many books on teaching grammar. But I know that you signposted a couple of studies there, Ian. I know that, Sian, you referenced the writing revolution. So perhaps you could just talk a little bit about, you know, where you go for your professional learning on your reading.
I think the first thing to remember is that good teaching and learning is good teaching and learning, irrespective of context. And if you're saying something is effective teaching in another area, it's the same with grammar. You know, we've already talked about doing it in context, making sure that you're tackling misconceptions, making connections. I think we have to, you don't need to necessarily look for what good teaching, but what you might need to do is look for nice activities. And there's lots of sort of grammar textbooks out there which can give you activities which can help that teaching of grammar. But I think that that's the first thing I would say, is you don't need necessarily to learn what good grammar teaching is, because it's the same as every other type of teaching.
Well, that's very good to know. Anybody want to add?
I must say, when we were reading and looking into this as a school, I did struggle to find texts that were really useful for teaching such young children, because I teach 5 and 6 year olds. I teach year 1, and a lot of things touch very briefly on that and then race on then to what they need when they're much older. But I like the Pike Corbett Talk for Writing approach, because it's all about categorizing and structuring things. And, you know, if you've got a symbol and a movement, right, we're going to practice our verbs that we need for this story today, and let's go over the moves. It's just a way, again, of helping the children think, okay, these are our verbs, these are the moves that we've done today, and these are verbs, and this is what we understand about this kind of word, or these are the adjectives. I'm going to need this when I'm describing this, and these are the movements that we've done. So I've just found that approach, and again, with very young children, you're not going to, they can't produce, they haven't got the stamina, some of them, or the muscle strength to produce a lot of writing. So a lot of the grammar has to be done through oracy first, and then when they catch up, when their little bodies catch up, then they'll be able to do it, hopefully, because there's been a lot of this verbal modeling, like you're saying, a lot of the, you know, and the visuals and the whole body experience of grammar is going to help them, I think, to remember these rules when they go to writing in a more extended way when they're older. So I found that Pike Corbett has helped me with that kind of thing.
And I think Sian referred to it, but I'm really enjoying the writing revolution at the moment.
Yes.
I'm going through it, and I've had loads of
really got a big following.
Oh, do you know what? And using it, as you say, as starters, little games at the start of every lesson, and literally just 2 minutes. I'm trying to scramble sentences. Look, I've got all these words, put them into order, put them in a sentence for me. The kids love them, and they don't really understand that they're learning. You know those activities where the children just do it without realizing how much they're working. They're like that, and I'm really finding them really beneficial in my starters and the beginning of my lessons, definitely. I've looked a little bit on Alan Peate's work. I think Alan Peate, I do like what he's doing, but I think it'll take more time to embed that into the school, whereas I'm finding Writing Revolution really easy. to use and to apply to lessons.
And it's something you can show the teachers quite easily, isn't it? These are some activities that you can try at any age, at any level. Yeah.
And this week, for example, we've got a themed week where, as teachers, we've all took responsibility for one element of the week for the whole school. So I was doing literacy. So I've put these little starters into the lessons for the whole school so that everyone can try them out.
Lovely.
And I know I don't really need to explain it to them because it's quite easy and it's just doing it fun.
Yeah. And do you know
they
what?
can be applied to any subject as well.
Any subjects, and they're cross phase as well, and I think that it's a really nice way to end on that notion of fun and the whole body experience of grammar. Thank you so much for joining me today and making grammar a lot less intimidating. Thank you for your honesty as well in sharing some of the kind of challenges that you've faced as educational professionals. So really, really grateful to you. Please follow us on Twitter, and you can find all of our professional learning on Central South Consortium's website as well. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Diolch am wrando ar y benod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.